Yeah. So our panel debate today will focus on the Kurdish women's fight for freedom, with a focus on women from the Women's Protection Unit in Rojava in northern Syria. So as a Western audience, most of us just nowadays view the Middle East in a very chaotic state. But what we also see is a bunch of very strong women who are gaining a lot of influence and attention in the region. These women are simply inspiring us, and most of us are thinking, who are they? The Western media and public is primarily occupied with how these women look, what outfit they wear, and if some of you recall, we even had one of the big Scandinavian brands, H&M, make a suit which portrayed the Kurdish women. But they also revoked the suit very fast from the collection as they were afraid to get into a political debate. So, as I said, many of us are wondering about these women, about the liberal or liberated stand that these strong Kurdish women have taken, especially when it comes to the fight against the terrorist organization ISIS. And despite the chaos in the Middle East and the brutality against the civilians, the Kurdish women have given the world hope and shown that radical forces will not be allowed to destroy the weakened democratic values in the region. And even though the media coverage of these Kurdish women have been intensified, there are just few stories about their ideas, actually. And there is also just few stories that looks upon the issue from an academic perspective. And that's why we're here today. We want to bring the academic perspective as well as an academic discussion. We're interested in highlighting the Kurdish situation in Rojava. We're interested in emphasizing on the nuances and to get more depth about this situation. And obviously, I mean, these women have not just joined this fight from one day to another. I mean, there is a socio-cultural and political history which underline these Kurdish women's strong position in the society, and that's what we're here for, to learn more about them. So let me just shortly present you the panel. We have Dilar Derek, who is a PhD student, and I just overheard her conversation. You said you're on your second year?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're in the Department of Sociology at Cambridge University, and you're researching the Kurdish women's movement. Then here we have Karyana, who is a PhD, an associate professor at the University of Bergen. She has studied the Kurdish women, the Kurdistan Workers' Party from an educational perspective. And then we have Anja Flack, all the way from Germany. She is a journalist and a writer. She is one of the few people, I may say, in the room who actually joined the PKK female fighters. Yeah. Then we have Nina Rasmussen. She's an author and adventurer. She has been writing, and as well as she has traveled in the area in Kurdistan. And then lastly, we have a friend of mine, Ashley. Most of you know her. He's worked in the United Nations, where he was responsible for women in conflict, about women, peace, and conflict studies. So we have 5 questions that we would like to assess during the event. Here they are. So the first one is, how do you see the development of the Kurdish women's liberation movement in the Middle East? That's the first one. Then we have the second one. That's how does the Kurdish women's liberation movement differ from other women movements in the Middle East? And why? How does the active political work initiated by the Kurdish diaspora in Europe? And then lastly, how is the Kurdish women's struggle perceived today by the West? And I think for some of us who are not so much in the situation, I think it would be really great if we can get sort of a historical background. So I'm hoping that Dilar, she will help me to kind of make the historical framework so that we know where we're situated and yeah.
First of all, thank you very much to the organizers for having us here. I'm very happy to be here in Copenhagen. It's my first time in Denmark. And thank you all for coming. It's very amazing to see so much interest in this topic right now, because when I first started researching the Kurdish women's movement, I wrote my master's in 2012 on the women in the PKK. It was such an underground topic that it required a lot of explaining, because people simply didn't believe that women in Kurdistan were leading an armed struggle, and not just for a couple of days, but for decades actually. So in fact, I'm quite happy to be accompanied, especially by these two women, because they were at that time really my only sources, I can say, academic sources. Because Anya has written a lot specifically on the Kurdish women's guerrilla struggle, and Kariana has written a lot on the PKK, and there were simply not many sources I could refer to during my research. But now, every day, maybe 10 people contact me asking me for sources. How can I write about the Kurdish women's movement? And it's amazing. And that also shows how far this movement has come from gaining so much attention, from being completely invisible just a couple of years ago. And we can definitely say that this attention has started after the murder of 3 Kurdish women in Paris, Sakine Cansız, Fidan Doğan, and Leyla Şaylemez. They were brutally killed in the heart of Paris, and I personally would like to dedicate my talk to them, specifically, and to the women struggling in Kobani. And I invite the other panelists to do the same. So I think without these 3 women, the women in Kobani would not have struggled today. This is very important to keep in mind. So, as I said, as a person who's researching this topic, I also want to speak about the sexism and the patriarchy in social research as well, that keeps people from doing meaningful research on this topic, because most of the sources that did not have this inside perspective, like Kariana or Anya's writings, were in fact issued by or sponsored by NATO, for example, or by the Turkish state, and these were very problematic sources that combined racism with sexism, and actually that's one part of the problem why there isn't so much available. So if we could just go to the first slide. This just looks like so much, but I'll just read an excerpt. This was a NATO-funded paper. This was sponsored by the NATO. And look at this person's explanation for Kurdish women's militancy. So basically he says, hormonal disturbances may be a factor in female participation in the terrorist organizations. Women seem to believe their commitment to terrorism is stronger than males because they have a deeper soul searching, and so on. Just very weird things like that. Women are by nature more violent and dangerous than men. This was funded by the NATO. This is a serious academic paper. Can you believe it? And
when was it?
Sorry?
When was it?
This was just a couple of years ago, actually. I can't remember, actually. I should have put the date on there, but it's not that long ago. So, women who participate in terrorist organizations are often described as unattractive. They lack the characteristics and traits that society considers as appropriate, such as gentleness, softness, and so on. So, you get that. You can just read on, but this was just to show you, childhood maladjustment, a terrible father, and so on. So these typical explanations for why women participate in armed struggle. Actually, it's fine now. I didn't want to read it all anyway, just to show you the framework within which this was perceived until recently. Okay, so until just a few months ago, this was the image that the world had of Kurdish women fighters. And why? Because their enemy, their primary enemy, was the Turkish state, and the Turkish state is the second largest NATO ally, and nobody challenges what NATO allies say, of course. So, another thing on top of that is, of course, the terrorist label on the PKK, which, for example, restricts people who want to conduct research from doing that, because your interview partners feel self-consciously wonder if you're a Secret Service agent, seriously. And you cannot do proper research, you cannot say the things you want to say because you risk being potentially labeled as a terrorist and you're just trying to find answers to questions you may have. So the terrorist label is also a huge obstacle to social sciences. So this was just an intro to just the framework within which people who want to conduct research, what they have to deal with. And also I want to conclude from how this developed into the current praise that we see now for the Kurdish women fighters. And one of the questions that were asked is, why is there so much praise for them now? And we see that because they're now fighting against an enemy that everyone can agree on that they're evil, the Islamic State, now suddenly the image of Kurdish women has changed. For the first time, people are seeing that Kurdish women are struggling, which is great, because before that they were invisible or labeled as evil witches and crazy psychopaths. Basically, this was the terminology. But it's very problematic if we now praise the Kurdish women who are fighting Islamic State without realizing that these are the same people. So the politics, the ideology, the motivations of these women are just completely blanked out from the media. Nobody says these women are fighting with the ideology of the PKK, with the ideology proposed by Abdullah Öcalan, because the PKK is labeled as terrorists. This is very uncomfortable for many people who just want to appropriate the Kurdish women's struggle for their own interests, without wondering why have these women been so strong and have been these enemies to the Islamic State. So, nationalism and feminism don't usually mix very well, because nationalism itself, the notion of the nation, is a very patriarchal concept. It usually has marginalized women, and even though in some nationalist struggles women have played active roles, on the other hand they were often forgotten afterwards. But the specific thing about the current Kurdish liberation movement is it has actually moved away from being this hardcore nationalist movement. Actually, it criticized nationalism from the beginning, but moved away from the idea of a nation state altogether, because it started criticizing the nation state along with capitalism and patriarchy as the pillars of the oppressive system at the moment. But that was part of the development. So Kurdish women were often, in literature as well, in between Kurdish nationalist men who wanted to use the supposedly more liberated status of Kurdish women as, look, our women are freer than Arab, Persian, Turkish women, so we don't need to liberate them anymore. This was one logic, for example, which of course sacrificed women's rights, women's liberation for the so-called nation. But on the other hand, Kurdish women were also abandoned by feminists in the countries that they live in, Turkey, for example, and in Iran, where they were not recognized as women with even more oppression. Because if we can just go to the next slide, it's important to keep in mind that Kurdish women, even though we now see their strength, their pride with which they struggle against a system like the Islamic State, which is explicitly feminicidal, it has explicitly launched a war on women, it's still important to keep in mind that Kurdish traditional society is in fact very, very patriarchal, very feudal. So rape, domestic violence, honor killings, they are quite common in Kurdish culture. And oppress them due to their ethnicity. Their struggle also goes against the patriarchy of the state, which oppresses all women. Their struggle is also due to socioeconomic exclusion. So even if Kurdish men are oppressed as well, Kurdish women are usually more oppressed because they don't have the same social mobility. They cannot just move away from their religion and get a job. Due to the last point, the patriarchy of the own community. So the struggle of Kurdish women and the current struggle that we see are actually in some way a result of this multiple front struggle that they have to lead due to several layers of oppression. So that's why it's important when we uncover what the Kurdish women's movement signifies and means today, we have to keep the whole historical background in mind, because the specific conditions of the Kurdish women have resulted to such a philosophy that eventually started to tackle several layers of oppression. Can we move on, please? So yes, from this multi-layered oppression, such a movement has eventually developed. So now we see Kurdish women not only on the streets, not only in parliaments, but also actively on the forefront against several systems and regimes. Because even though right now we talk about the Islamic State, Kurdish women have been fighting for decades against the Iranian regime, against the Turkish state, against Saddam Hussein at some point, and also against the Assad regime. So right now they're fighting against several very sexist and patriarchal systems. The Syrian regime systematically rapes women. ISIS, we don't have to talk about what they do to women. In Turkey, violence against women is increasing all the time. Iran, we will have a talk about the situation in Iran later on. So from there to this, and let's talk a little bit about that. These are the peace mothers that protest, who have lost their loved ones in war. Just some examples of the fact that women from all kinds of social strata actually take part in this. Okay, next. How the current movement that we see today has developed. Because even though there is not just one line, there is not just one Kurdish women's movement, there are several movements, several different approaches and so on, but what we call Kurdish women's movement, what actually can be called a movement because it's a mass grassroots movement, really, which includes all spheres of life, has been around the ideology of the PKK. So it's with that ideology also with which the fighters in Kobani are fighting. So women's liberation in the PKK has been articulated from the beginning. The PKK was founded in 1978 and took up armed struggle against Turkey in 1984. And from the beginning, women were a part of this. Because women's liberation has always been articulated along with the need for national liberation and also women's liberation. Without free women, the nation cannot be free either. And so that's why initially women took part because they believed in the socialist ideals of the PKK. But soon, very soon, they actually realized that they need to organize themselves autonomously because otherwise they will be forgotten too, because they experienced a lot of hard times inside the PKK as well. If you want to me to say more about this maybe later, because I really have to cut it down. So there were several stages inside this movement, from creating an autonomous army to an autonomous party, articulating a new paradigm, and moving away from the nation state with all its patriarchal and capitalist implications towards an alternative. And it's very interesting that this paradigm shift away from the nation state, because it's such a monopolized, concentrated force of power and domination and hegemony, that shift away in the PKK towards the late 90s and later on specifically articulated with the paradigm of democratic confederalism, later on went parallel and hand in hand with the autonomous organization of the women's movement. Because the realization was, we have to change the premises of freedom. We have to re-articulate what does freedom mean. If we just create yet another nation state, does that really mean that we have liberated society? Does liberation just mean to have a state like everyone else and reproduce the same conditions that have caused this whole situation to begin with? Should we have a hegemony of Kurds now? And what about the women? So these were questions that were asked. Next slide, please. And that's, this was supposed to come later. The airport, I just arrived from Diyarbakir this morning, and I was in Istanbul. I was trying to change my PowerPoint, but I was really self-conscious because I can't work properly with these kinds of images in Istanbul airport, so that's why I think. Yeah, but can you just go back? I'll just say that real quick. Yeah, no, just leave the next one.
The right one, it's that one.
Yeah, this one. This was supposed to come later, but I'll just talk about that now. Due to the armed struggle that women took up, the armies and states and the media in these Turkey, but also specifically Iran, have resorted to sexism to delegitimize the struggle of Kurdish women, because they saw that women played active roles in the uprisings, in the prisons uprisings, in the armed struggle, in parliament. Leyla Zana, for example, was a very famous symbol for that. So they have seen that women can play a very mobilizing role. So that's why they started to call these women in the PKK prostitutes, that they're actually just sex slaves of the men, that they're not really there, that they're confused, and so on. I gave an example of that earlier. Can we go to the next slide, please? So rather than acknowledging that these women are struggling, and they do so voluntarily because they see something in the struggle, whether you agree with it or not, but it's not right to just delegitimize it in such a sexist way. Okay? So, just very quickly, because I really have to wrap it up, I think, what is democratic confederalism? As I said, the PKK moved away from the idea of a nation state, because the start off was we want an independent, socialist, united Kurdistan. But later on, it developed the idea of democratic confederalism instead, which is based on ecology, on radical grassroots democracy, and specifically women's liberation, because the patriarchy, capitalism, and nationalism in the state were identified as the forces, the pillars of oppression at the current status quo. So instead, an alternative was advocated, and now the notion of the nation has changed as well. So now the PKK does not want liberation for the Kurdish nation, but to change what it means to be a nation. It means that several different people live there, Turks, Arabs, Kurds, Assyrians, and so on, and together they have to establish a nation in thought, based on common principles rather than on an ethnicity. And we see a very good example of the implementation of that in Rojava, and later on we will have talks about that. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, you can just skip that. This is just one example of how this has also impacted the legal sphere in Turkey. This is a map of Turkey, and in the municipal elections of last year, this area is the Kurdish region, southeast and east Turkey. Only there women were elected as mayors, actually, and this only includes the official mayors, because the Kurdish movement has, in fact, within this paradigm shift, introduced the idea of co-chairs, so basically on all levels, from party presidencies down to local neighborhood councils, there's always one man and one woman, and there's gender quotas, etc. And you see that even not the unofficial ones, the co-presidents included, still, most women that are in politics in Turkey, even though they make up the minority, are Kurdish. And this is due to the Kurdish liberation movement and specific emphasis on women's liberation. This is a picture I took in Rojava, so we can skip that. These are just some last things. I really want to say a lot more, because there's so much to say, but we can do that in the question and answer section. Just a few points to conclude. It's very important to keep in mind the framework within which this is taking place. War and women, the militarization of women, women taking up armed struggle, is a taboo break everywhere in the world. It's not seen as normal. It's seen as a so radical break with tradition. And that's why it's important to analyze the situation that is going on right now very well. The Kurdish women are fighting against explicitly sexist systems, and they are able to succeed because they have an ideology, they have a backup, they have a base on which their ideology is founded. The liberation of Kobani, everyone's eyes was on Kobani, right? So, and the first thing that happened was these people took out pictures of Abdullah Öcalan when they liberated Kobani. And this is very uncomfortable for the world, and you do not have to like the PKK or Öcalan. You can criticize everything, but this is the reality. You cannot undermine the ideology with which people fight against ISIS fascism at the moment. So we see women like Sakine Cansız, after their deaths, being labeled as terrorists, even in European media. The ISIS and Kurdish women's struggle being simply portrayed in terms of boys beating girls, or trying to make this revolution into something very sexy and attractive. But no, the current struggle of Kurdish women is based on a long history of uprisings, of hunger strikes in prisons, in guerrilla warfare in the Kandil Mountains, and this is a result of a lot of sacrifices. So we must not just sanitize it and pick out the stuff that we like. So we have to question the system in which we live in, and also ask why this country also took away, for example, the broadcasting license of a TV channel that was a voice for these women. So this is a global problem, right? And the women in Kobani are not just physically fighting against the Islamic State, they also have a philosophy. They want to create an alternative life. They have a clear vision about how that is, and I'll just summarize it in my last sentence with a poster that I've seen in Rojava and Kamisho. It said, "We will defeat ISIS by securing the liberation of women in the Middle East." And that just means that this is not just a military fight, this is about philosophy, this is about a worldview. And that's why, if we really want to support these women, we have to look at their politics and support them as well, rather than just glamorizing them. Thank you very much.
She is also the Vice Dean for Education at the Department of Education at the University of Bergen. Her research related to knowledge and learning process in social and political movement and in areas of war and conflict. Much of her research is linked to the PKK and its educational foundation. And another thread of your research is also multiculturalism. So I think that you can start when you're ready.
Thank you, Asu. As Asu said, I've conducted research on the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK. And as Dila also said, in a way, it all started with the PKK. So much of the ideas and things that are going on in Rojava now actually started with the PKK, and it's the ideas of Abdullah Öcalan. And I think that is important to keep in mind. PKK camps in Genere and in Kandil. I also have a study on the youth in Mahmoud, the Mahmoud camp. I will come back to that later. As Dila said, Kurdish issues and the Kurdish question have been under-researched. And it's also very difficult to conduct research in the Kurdish areas, especially in Turkey, but also, I guess, in Iran and other parts, like Syria previously. I can just say that I was banned from Turkey in 2009 and was declared persona non grata. So when I tried to go back, and I didn't know about it, I wasn't aware of it. So when I was going to a women's conference in Ahmed in Diyarbakir in 2010, April, I was arrested at the airport. The foreign ministry of Norway, they asked me, should we send a request of why you were arrested? Yes, I said that would be great. And we actually got a letter back, a very important document, stating just the same that citizen Karianne Westram is not allowed to go to Turkey, blah, blah. But no explanation. Yeah, so that is the reality, and that's also why there are not many research pieces or books or articles that are really from the ground. But Dila is a coming scholar, and I'm sure she will contribute a lot to the field. When I received the theme for this panel, the Kurdish women on the front line, my thoughts went to women who for more than 30 years have sacrificed everything. They left their families in secrecy, many of them. They turned them back to the family life, to children, to a job perhaps, a career, and thousands of them gave their lives for the cause, not only for the Kurds, not only for Kurdish women, but for women's liberation in general, and in the broadest sense for humankind. And I also, as Dila, want to show to Sakine Sanchez, I will not go into that, but actually Sakine was the first to organize women's squads. She was the founder of the PKK, one of the members. She was also a head militant of Kurdish people and women's freedom movement. And she had a lot of important tasks within the PKK movement. And she never shied away from speaking her mind, especially not when it came to gender issues and women issues. And for this, she actually spent a life on the front line, both militarily, politically, and I will add educationally. Because these three concepts are inextricably intertwined. I had the honor of meeting Sakina a few times, and she's a person you never forgot. Because she left you with a conviction that she knew exactly why she was fighting and what she was fighting for. And that is exactly what the Women Protection Unit, the YPJ Women in Kobane and Rojava, does. They know why they are fighting. And Dila also posed that issue. It was first in the summer of 2014 that Kurdish women came to the forefront. The YPG and the PKK, they really became Kurdish women on the front line. The fact that they already had fought against Al-Qaeda-affiliated groups was unknown to many. They made the international media headlines for a long time and even now. And they constructed representations of these women soldiers as heroic, young, pretty, braver than men, all true. Because where in the world do you meet an army of women like this, challenging and overpowering the most brutal gangs of IS bandits? Aside from the military protection, they confronted traditional gender expectations in the region and redefined the role of women in conflict. But where does the power come from? And in order to say something about it, I need to make a brief detour around the PKK and its educational project, which built on the same ideas as the PYD and the YPG. The YPG as well as the YPG as well as the YPJ are not sent to the front from day one. Previously, previous to military training, they had training and educational activities as their comrades in the PKK. Political literacy and educational activity are at the bottom of all activities, and I will argue that without this clear educational foundation, the PKK, PYD would have been weaker and perhaps not survived the horrible challenges and threats they have faced both in Rojava. During the 1980s and 90s, thousands of youth went to the mountains to fight with PKK. In lack of formal educational opportunities for millions of Kurdish youth, literacy courses and political education took place in a variety of non-formal sites, in the mountains, in prisons, in the communities, in towns, streets, and even later diaspora. New technology and media and TV channels became important educational sites. Which made it easy to rapidly mobilize for collective action in, for example, the streets. These educational sites are where the Kurds break the culture of silence and learn what it means to participate and be politically literate. Actually, from the very beginning in the late 70s, education was central to the development of the movement. The PKK regards education as an activity that permeates all levels of social life and anchors educational elements in all its activities. Well, in media, the YPG often say that they fight in order to bring change. Well, the core of the PKK pedagogy is to enable members to change the society by learning how to read the word, text, what is written, actually being able to read and write, but also to unveil hidden meanings behind the text. Like, for example, how Kurds and Kurdistan is presented in textbooks, in school books, for example, in history books. But also to read the world, meaning the political and social reality. The PKK believe that as humans, we are not only in the world, but also with the world, and have the capacity to adapt to a reality, make choices, and transform or change reality. A process that seems to contribute to critical awareness and to the development of social and political knowledge. The educative dimension of the PKK was one of the factors that made people turn their devotion towards the movement. During the war in the 1990s between Turkish military and the PKK, women guerrillas went to the villages to teach children and adults reading and writing and make women aware of their subordinate position in the family and society as such. The military coup in 1980, when tens of thousands of Kurdish men were detained, forced women to political action. The new political trend was women's involvement, both in politics and as militants. The decision to break out of this cycle of double repression became an expression and articulation of new aspirations and independence. Entering into military training program combined with literacy and political studies represents an important political, social and ideological move for many women. During the first decades, the PKK involved women in the guerrilla and in organized political activities. The PKK had in fact the largest number of female guerrillas in the world. And in addition to women from the villages and cities in the Kurdish region in Turkey, also a huge number of politically conscious and educated women also from Europe attended the guerrilla, especially following the capturing of Öcalan in 1999. And this is from Anja Flak, because according to Anja Flak, our co-panelist here, it would be naive to assume that Kurdish female fighters have gained this position without struggling hard, including inside the PKK, to be accepted as equal to the male comrades. Education became a significant issue, crucial in order to liberate Kurdish women in general and also those who attended the armed struggle. The informants in my studies claim that they have changed as persons. They have become someone. And that the perception of the world has been altered after having participated in political education and other learning activities organized by the PKK. One of the elements that really make the PKK-PYD movement empowering is its emphasis on collective thinking and acting. You are not only for yourself, you act on behalf of a greater unity, on a collective level. Transformation or change, transformation is a different concept, it contains more than change, cannot be achieved if those engaging in these processes believe that the world cannot be changed no matter what they do. You really have to believe in your cause and that you will succeed as a collective, as a bigger we. And I guess this is also the strength of the YPG women. When the YPG fighters talk about the politics of liberation, it is essentially about activity or doing on the basis of a language of hope. Because the force underpinning gender liberation is the desire for change and the belief that liberation is possible. Kurdish youth in all states where the Kurds reside and diaspora is responding to Kobane in a very interesting way. For many, it is first and foremost a story of heroism. Like in the newspapers, it is a story of national sentiments and materialization of the image of Kurds and Kurdistan they had grown up with. For the diaspora youth, the discourse is before Kobane and after Kobane. So Kobane brought about a sense of belonging a lot stronger. I will at the end say something about the youth in Mahmoud. Many of you sit here, you know Mahmoud. But for those who don't, in 2013 I visited Mahmoud refugee camp to interview students from 16 to 25 years. Mahmoud is a desert camp with about 12,000 refugee residents without proper ID or status. They had built up a village from nothing else than their bare hands. And with no support from the international community or aid organizations, because of accusations of being supportive of the PKK. And it's also said that the PKK hide wounded guerrillas there. So the international community says, no, you won't get anything. But the fact is, without the PKK, this camp would not have survived and the people there would not have survived. For the youth in Mahmoud camp, politics is just as vital as food and water. The social surroundings are highly politicized. They see themselves as a bigger we, and they would not even dream of leaving the camp on an individual basis. They built their homes and schools with their bare and bloody hands as children. And those who have reached higher education go back to Mahmoud to teach and learn their skills to other residents for free. It is a gift to the parents who did not even learn to read and write. I had several conversations with groups of youth in Mahmoud. It was striking how conscious they were, how much knowledge they had, and how determined they were to return to a free and liberated Kurdistan, not one by one, but together. I was there for a week. Each day, one or two youngsters were missing in the groups, simply because they had left for the mountains during the night, or they went to Rojava to fight. To conclude, the mountains, the camp, diaspora, Rojava and Kobane, it all comes together as one. They are all connected to a common goal. The struggle of the YPJ fighters in Kobane is highly political, and their struggle is a response to the Kurdish people's need to restore an assimilated self-understanding, gain awareness of an oppressive situation, the gender issue included, to gain self-governance through direct democracy and civic tolerance, and to change all these conditions through a transformative practice. I am sure they will succeed. Thank you.